Without further ado, I would like to go ahead and turn it over to you, Dave, and just remind everybody again to please feel free to enter your questions in the chat as the presentation is going, and then also afterwards we'll have plenty of time for questions. So go ahead, Dave.
All right, thank you, Savannah, and thanks everybody for stopping by our virtual booth here at the virtual open house. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about the fisheries and ecosystem modeling work that we do in our lab. And I also want to go ahead and acknowledge and thank Dylan and Daniel, my two PhD students, for contributing to this talk and for all the hard work they've done. I'll highlight a couple of their projects. So before I go on, it's good to kind of think about where ecosystem models fit in terms of fisheries management. So when a fisheries management action is taken, there's a lot of things that go into that, including stock assessments, data collection, stakeholder input. There's a separate process for developing regulations. And then there's ecosystem models over here on the side that don't have an official place in this, but we're working hard to plug into the existing management framework. And of course, all these different components feed into each other as well. So ecosystem models can help with stock assessment, they can help inform data collection. But ultimately, we're trying to use them to help managers make better decisions about natural resources, provided that they have a better understanding of how the ecosystem might respond. So what we can learn from ecosystem models ranges from things that are kind of just strategic and qualitative, such as like when to add more precaution, whether or not you should adjust parameters in the stock assessment, all the way up to the types of advice that's more tactical and quantitative, things like understanding how harvest policies of one species might affect another, and getting eventually to optimum combinations of fishing mortalities. If we think about some of the example applications for ecosystem models and some of the things that we're working on in my lab, a couple of them kind of stand out. For example, red tide mortality is a big issue on the west coast of Florida, as you all are aware. And fisheries managers are often concerned about, when they're going to set an annual catch limit. If a red tide is occurring, how should they adjust their catch advice with that red tide taking place at the time? In other cases, there's multiple stressors. For example, in the northern Gulf of Mexico, we did a model that looked at the combination of lionfish, oil spills, and fishing mortality, trying to determine how those are affecting reef fish webs in the northern Gulf. As far as how harvest policies may change under environmental, how well they perform under environmental change, things like climate change, precipitation patterns, river flow, all can impact primary production in the system, which could impact overall system productivity. And then getting into some of the more tactical management advice as far as stock rebuilding, setting precautionary limits on forage fish harvest, and ultimately up to multi-species reference points, which is kind of the ideal scenario for ecosystem-based management. Today, I'm going to talk about two projects that both Dylan and Daniel are working on. One that focuses on changes in primary production associated with outflow from the Suwannee River, and another looking at red tide mortality on the West Florida Shelf. So this is Dylan Sinnickson. He's my PhD student, and he's been developing an ecosystem model for the Suwannee River estuary. And developing an ecosystem model always requires a big effort in data integration. And so what Dylan has done is gone and analyzed the fish abundance and diet data from the FWC Fisheries Independent Monitoring Program. He's also brought in water quality data from Project Coast to get an idea of how nutrients have changed over this time period, and also information on recreational fishery landings and effort from the Marine Recreational Information Program. And so he built this model of the Cedar Key area using the EcoPath with EcoSim approach. His model has 59 functional groups, and it's calibrated to the FIM time series of abundance from 1997 to 2018. And we primarily been using the model to look at ecosystem responses to changes in freshwater flow. And one of the things that Dylan's working on for his dissertation is evaluating these future flow scenarios. As many of you know, since about the year 2000, the Suwannee River has experienced a higher frequency of these low flow events. And long-term climate projection models are predicting warmer temperatures and higher evapotranspiration rates in the high emission scenarios from those models. And so what Dylan's done is run these projection scenarios through his ecosystem model, looking at different ranges of river discharge. And these were all informed by the study by New Payne et al. 2019, who did a projection model for the Suwannee River. And there were three kind of, to bracket the uncertainty in those projections. We looked at a flood scenario, a moderate drought scenario, and an extreme drought scenario. And what kind of stands out is that within the flood and the moderate drought conditions, you don't really see dramatic changes in forage fish biomass. Dylan's here is focusing on the sweeter forage fish species. But in these severe drought scenarios, which would be about a 55% decrease in flow, we start to see pretty extreme declines in forage fish abundance. But those responses are different across forage species. And so looking far out into the future, there are some climate scenarios that could result in pretty drastic changes to the ecosystem. One of the nice things about these models is that they can be take on another life, and they can be used in other projects. And we were fortunate enough to have this project recently funded. Mike Allen is the lead PI, but this is funded by the National Academies of Science Gulf Research Program. But what we're trying to do here is integrate this ecosystem modeling with river basin, the basin-wide modeling, to get an idea of how land use change and climate scenarios will affect water coming out of the Suwannee River, and how that in turn will affect the estuarine ecosystem and food web. So this project's just getting started, and so it's nice to know Dylan's got about a year left on his dissertation, but his model will live on for at least another 3 years as this project progresses. The next project I want to talk about is the Westwater Shelf ecosystem model, and this is a model that I actually built. It's been, gosh, almost 10 years ago since I started it. And this was designed around federally managed species, primarily reef fish, groupers, and snappers. And this was developed back in 2013 as part of my dissertation. And then recently we got funding from NOAA Restore to update the model and primarily update the spatial component of the model. And so Daniel Velas, my other PhD student, has been working on this project to update the Westwater Shelf ecospace model, which is a spatial simulation of the food web, by incorporating dynamic environmental drivers, temperature, salinity, and chlorophyll A. So you can see these animations on the right of your screen over here, where we have certain environmental parameters are changing at a monthly time step, and then we get a response in fish biomass over the Westwater Shelf. And we're using this mainly to simulate red tide events. And so we're trying to work with the existing stock assessment process. There's an ongoing stock assessment for gag grouper. We want to provide some input for that assessment. And so what this model can generate is a time series of red tide mortality that can then plug into the stock assessment. And the way we've done this is we first have to generate red tide maps, and we use satellite imagery and combine that with the FWC HAB monitoring data. And so you can see how those maps are changing over time in that lower map. And if you look at these few plots here for gag going from August 2005, and then the most severe red tide in this time series was 2005, and it peaked in September. So you can see how the model basically kills that biomass in this area where the red tide was really intense between Tampa Bay and Charlotte Harbor. And we do that at a monthly time step, and we're then able to generate this time series of red tide mortality. And one of the things that stands out really is because these red tides occur closer to shore, we get a much more substantial impact on the younger age stanzas for groupers, because as you know, they spend the first year of life in the estuary, and as they age, they move out to the reefs and offshore, on the offshore part of the shelf. And so those lines that have the higher mortality rate are associated with the younger ages for gag groupers. And what's nice about this approach is that in theory, it can eventually be used to make near real-time assessments of red tide impacts on managed fish populations. So just to kind of wrap things up about fisheries ecosystem modeling and what it is, I think there's the type of models that we built are called end-to-end models, and so they model everything from primary production up to top predators. But they all require sort of the same steps of data integration, finding habitat preferences, bringing in the food habits data, using them to assess episodic events or environmental drivers, and then ultimately feeding that back into natural resource assessment and management. And so that's a summary of the work that we do in the lab, and I am happy to take any questions at this point.
All right, wonderful. Well, everybody, don't be shy. Feel free to ask Dave anything you'd like. We also have several of Dave's students here in attendance. So if you have any questions for them as well, you can type them in the chat or feel free to unmute.
Crickets.
So I have a question about the gag grouper stuff. Do you think that any of the results from that would be able to come up with, would be able to feed into economic models to figure out kind of how much was lost in terms of gag grouper fishery or anything along the lines of economic impacts of red tide?
Yes, it's possible. We haven't proposed any of that. But it's definitely easier to do with commercial fisheries because the lost biomass can be accounted for in terms of lost land use value. But for something like gag grouper that has a pretty large recreational component, it gets a little bit more difficult to characterize that because we have to understand how effort responded due to red tides. So there is potential to do that, but we haven't actually made that linkage yet.
All right, so you had a question come in from Holden. So it's about the forage fish model, and he wonders, do the gross estimates for the declines, like the 29% that you mentioned, account for niche shifts, like something filling in for pinfish?
Honestly, Dylan might be a better person to answer that question, but I can speculate just because what we're doing here is that actually changing the system-wide productivity. So it's likely that we would see a decline in fish biomass across all species. But there are scenarios with these models where you have a lot of species in them where sometimes we call them the vampires in the basement or something. So you do something and all of a sudden stingrays take over the system. And we've seen models that can predict some counterintuitive responses in certain scenarios.
Dylan, did you have anything to add on that question?
No, I didn't. The 29% was just total. You guys can hear me? Yeah, the total 29% decrease, that was for all forage fish. So we did see some changes within our forage fish groups. I think pinfish and anchovies tended to be the most sensitive taxa to the drought conditions. Regarding niche shifts, yeah, I didn't really take into account maybe changes of non-forage fish, maybe taking the role of some of the niches that were being filled by forage fish. But like Dave mentioned, I think the changes in overall productivity are going to be seen throughout all different trophic levels, from forage fish all the way to recreationally important fish.
Yeah, I was thinking of forage fish shifting. Some of the more successful or less sensitive species shifting over. So it sounds like you accounted for that. So I understand that better. Thanks, Dylan.
All right, well, everyone feel free to type questions in the chat, or else I'm just going to keep asking Dave questions. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the new stone crab project, since that's a favorite fishery of everybody's. I didn't hear you mention it in this talk. That might be something people would be interested in too.
Yeah, so I didn't include it in the talk just because I didn't want to spend too much time talking. So we have a new project that just started, well, actually started back in March, trying to develop new models for the stone crab fishery. As we have noticed, the stone crab landings have been pretty volatile over the last 10 years with some declining trend. And we've never really been able to assess that stock very well because of the nature of the fishery. It just lands the claws, so we don't have an estimate of the number of crabs that have been actually killed by the fishery. And so back when I worked at FWC, I was collaborating with Ryan Gandy and Claire Crowley, who are also PIs on the project, and Savannah is a co-PI on the project. And so this project has three main components. One is to build a more advanced population model of stone crabs. Claire and Ryan have advanced their data collection programs over the last 10 years. And so since that's been about the time since the last stock assessment. And so now we're going to try to integrate some of these data into an actual population model for stone crabs. The second component has a bioeconomic component. So Frank Ash, who is also a PI, he's a faculty member in Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences. He is leading a bioeconomic component, trying to understand how the demand and price relationships are for stone crab, because there's also a lot of volatility in the price of the claws landed. And then the third component is a stakeholder engagement process where we will have basically 2 rounds of workshops along the west coast of Florida. And the first round will be more of a scoping phase where we'll sit down with some of the stone crabbers and try to understand what are their perceptions on the fishery, what are the fishery practices that can maybe be improved on in terms of better claw removal technique, better handling, on-deck handling practices. And we'll take some of that information and incorporate it into the models, and then come back at the end of the project, do another round of workshops where we'll actually demonstrate to them what are some of the economic impacts of certain policy options that we're able to generate with the models, and really try to build some understanding and build some trust in the management system that some of what they may perceive as restrictive policy options might actually have long-term economic benefits as the resource begins to recover. So we're all really excited about that project. There's a lot of interest in stone crabs right now, just given their kind of uncertain status and some of the other economic pressures that are taking place. So we're off and running with that project, and maybe next year we can provide more results on that. But I'm happy to take questions about stone crabs if anybody has any.
Awesome, thanks, Dave. Well, at this stage, I'm going to go ahead and hop off and hand the Q&A back over to Cassandra to finish out, because I'm presenting on the next Nature Coast Currents that starts at 4:30. So great job, Dave, and everybody. You still have about 10 minutes left to ask Dave questions, and we hope that we'll see you in the next session as well.
Thank you, Savannah.
Just in case anybody needs it, I just put the link for the next Nature Coast Currents with Savannah in the chat box. It also looks like Holden has said ecosystem reference points have been management.
Yeah, so ecosystem reference points. The first step in that is defining what they are. And I'll talk about another project that I'm still involved in on the Atlantic coast for Atlantic Menhaden. And I'm part of a committee on the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, and we were tasked with actually coming up with ecological reference points for Atlantic Menhaden, which, as most of you know, is a major forage fish and also supports the largest fishery on the east coast of the U.S. in terms of tonnage landed. And it's interesting because when it comes down to management, ecological reference points or ecosystem reference points really involve trade-offs. So how do you want to manage the ecosystem depends on how you want the fisheries. In Hayden, we developed ecological reference points based off of the trade-off of Atlantic menhaden harvest and striped bass biomass. And we established ERPs as the fishing mortality rates for Atlantic menhaden that would sustain striped bass at their target levels if striped bass are fished at their target levels. And so the way we approached that is we actually presented to managers the trade-off curve. And we told them that, this is where you are and this is where you want to be. Now you can kind of decide, how you want to manage the fisheries given your management objectives. And it essentially comes down to a value-based decision. How do you value menhaden fisheries versus how do you value your sport fisheries? And once managers can set those and define those objectives, then we can start to develop what would be like the optimum ecosystem-based fishing scenario to optimize those ERPs. So I think that the development of ERPs or ecosystem reference points, whatever you want to call them, is going to be case specific. If you're talking about a predator-prey system, the ERPs may look different than something where you want to account for environmental variability or climate change or something like that. Holden just commented that it's different in the single species management, and that's absolutely right. Going to ecosystem reference points or ecosystem-based management is going to require some changes in how the management framework is structured. For example, with Atlantic menhaden, the different species are all assessed independently of one another. Their objectives and reference points are set independently of one another. But in the model that we developed, actually highlighted the need for all these different single species committees to come together and try to set global reference points or global targets for the whole system that then we could optimize over. So modeling is just one side of it. I think to get to that ecosystem-based management level is going to require some restructuring of the framework as well.
We've got just a couple of minutes for any last questions.
I mean, I'll of course ask questions all day. If not other ones, I don't want to monopolize it though. Does there seem to be political will for that at the policy level?
I think that again, it depends. Like in the case of Atlantic menhaden, their role as a forage fish have been recognized for decades, and they were actually under a lot of pressure from the public to adopt these ecological reference points. And I think that's what drove managers to do so. When they first approved Amendment 3, they had more public comment on that amendment and the ERPs than they had any other amendment that had ever been made by the commission. And so I think the public interest and public engagement is going to drive managers to do so. When we go to Gulf menhaden, it's a completely different story. That fishery is managed by Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission, but is really kind of self-managed by the industry. And so there's less appetite for it or less motivation for managers to start thinking about ELPs. But I would say in general, managers are a little bit hesitant. They don't really know what ecosystem-based management looks like. There's a lot of uncertainty in the models that have to be addressed. But I would say that slowly the conversation is shifting towards can we, not from can we, but yes, should we, and we're seeing more interest in that, at least in the Southeast. Now other regions have been more proactive and are further down the road with ecosystem.
Well, our time for this one is about up, and I wanted to thank you, Dave, for your time and the presentation and for the work from Daniel and Dylan. Thank you, Holden, for your great questions. I also wanted to let you all know that I'm about to launch a poll. If you could take a moment to fill that out. Should be popping up in just a moment. And then again, when you're finished with that, we have our next Nature Coast Current coming up with Savannah, and the link is posted in the chat box if you'd like to join us there.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks for coming. I'm going to log off and join Savannah's presentation now.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See you on the next Zoom.
Yep.